World News. Now Hard Talk with Sarah Montague.
We are in a depression, so says my guest today. Unemployment at levels last seen during the 30s, an economic crisis in the Eurozone, and the prospect of worse to come. But he reckons none of this needs to be happening. He's the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, and he reckons that America and Europe should be richer than they were 5 years ago. And even now, it wouldn't take much to solve the problem. What debt-ridden governments should be doing is borrowing more to spend their way out of trouble. Paul Krugman, welcome to Hard Talk.
Hi there.
Can you really solve the problem of excessive debt with more debt?
Yes, you can. And the thing to understand is that the problem is not so much the overall level of debt as the fact that right now everyone is trying to pay down their debt at the same time. And the trouble with that, of course, is, well, I should say, of course, but apparently doesn't get through, is that my spending is your income. Your spending is my income. If you and I both decide we have too much debt and both say we need to slash spending, the result is a depression, which leaves us both worse off. So what we need to do right now, while the private sector is trying desperately to work down its debt levels, is temporarily the public sector needs to step in there and do the spending that the private sector will not. So this is we're very much in a counterintuitive sort of world, but one that actually economists are supposed to understand pretty well.
And they're supposed to understand it because of Keynes. Maynard Keynes, back in the early part of the 20th century, saying that the boom, not the slump, is the time for austerity.
That's right. John Maynard Keynes, a little bit of Irving Fisher, his American contemporary, saying much the same thing in different phrases. Yeah, this is familiar territory. You can take things Keynes wrote, take out a few archaisms of the stylistic, of the way he wrote, and they read like they're about events today. And his recipe for recovery is every bit as relevant now as then.
And yet what you say in your new book, which is End This Depression Now, which is the obvious thing that there is a way of doing it, is that actually the way to do it needn't be painful, it needn't involve sacrifices. And yet here we are in something that we haven't seen in decades, and it's very big and very painful.
That's right. And there's a wonderful phrase that Keynes used early on in 1930. He talked about having magneto trouble, which was, an old-fashioned term for trouble with the electrical system in your car. And it's as if you have a dead battery. And you think, well, here's this car, and it's this big, expensive thing, and it's not running at all. So the car must be fundamentally flawed, and fixing it must be a protracted and painful process. And they say, no, it's a small thing, and it's a dead battery. And if we would replace the dead battery, we can be going again. And that's very much where we are right now. Now, of course, trouble is convincing people of that. And I actually build on that a little bit in End This Depression Now. I say, if your car is not running because of a dead battery, but your husband refuses to admit that the problem is simply a dead battery and refuses to spend $100 to replace that battery and insists that you take buses instead, you have a problem. Very difficult problem. It may be an insoluble problem, but the problem is not with the car. Right? What we have is a political and an intellectual problem, not really an economic problem.
OK, well, let's take a look at how it applies to the UK, because the UK has made much of its austerity programme, and you have been very, very critical of the British way, what the British government has been doing since 2010. But actually, the British government, in one sense, hasn't been doing that badly, has it? I mean, if you look at what's happened recently, the forecast for GDP, the year after next, are 2%. Right. It wouldn't be in this situation if it weren't for the crisis of Europe, its main trading partner.
I don't think that's actually right. I mean, that's exaggerated. And let me say that it is actually the truth that the British austerity so far has been not that much more than the de facto austerity in America. So the government here likes to say we actually haven't done all that much austerity relative to other places, which is mostly true. It's been a bit more. But what's special about Britain we're all mucking up. We're all making a hash of policy in this. The Eurozone is making a hash. The United States is making a hash of it. But in both of those cases, you can argue that there are fundamental structural or political reasons. The Europeans have this common currency that doesn't work. The United States has one of our two major political parties is stark raving mad. Britain stands out in the fact that its error is unforced. This government does not have to be doing this. It is choosing out of a misunderstanding of the situation to do a destructive economic policy.
Okay, but you look back at what the situation was in 2010 when this government came into power, and at that stage, UK public and private debt together was higher than any other country in the world apart from Japan. Confidence then was an issue, and that was the point upon which the Chancellor, George Osborne, based things, that you've got to get the markets confident and then growth will follow.
There was never any sign that Britain was facing a crisis in its ability to borrow. That public-private debt thing partly reflects the fact that London's a financial center, so it makes the numbers look large. But in fact, no country, no advanced country with a stable government, with its own currency, borrowing in its own currency, has had any difficulty at all borrowing. And you can look at US and UK and Swedish and German. Effectively, Germany has its own currency called the euro. Look at the borrowing costs, and they've all moved in tandem. Japan, with enormous levels of debt. None of these countries have faced immediate borrowing concerns. There is no indication whatsoever. This was an imaginary crisis.
Except the problem is you have a look at all the serious heavyweight figures who've taken a look at what the British did, not least Christine Lagarde of the IMF, who said the other day, when trying to imagine what the situation would be like today if no such fiscal consolidation program had been decided, I shiver.
Well, but that was the problem. There was an enormous psychological fear of the wrong thing. Now, it's very interesting, actually, if you read that IMF statement. We don't have the full report, but the IMF statement starts by sort of endorsing the Cameron government's policies, and then point by point says, actually, this is wrong. So if you actually read the analysis as opposed to the headline statements, but they're saying that this was a terrible mistake.
Except the analysis says it shows that if it's not working by November, then cut taxes and boost infrastructure spending by £30 billion.
But why November? Why not now?
Because in fact, described the Chancellor George Osborne as courageous.
Well, yes, but that's diplomacy. Particularly since the fund actually did kind of endorse the policy to begin with, it's very difficult for Christine Lagarde to say, and by the way, we screwed up badly too. So, no, I mean, in practice,
all politics.
In practice, fund staff, IMF staff, believes that this was a terrible error. And they're saying I can infer it pretty clearly. It's quite clear
You're
that
just
they believe
inferring it from the public comments.
Yes, I'm not. I don't have an inside pipeline, but I do know what their models look like, and their models are not very different from mine. And they say that this was a terrible mistake. So no,
but they also say all these other things, and it's as if you're taking what actually chimes with what you're saying and discarding all the rest, like the fact that the head of the IMF is shivering at the prospect of.
But everyone was shivering. If you take. Let's back away from it, because of course the IMF has no special monopoly on wisdom either. One thing that has not made it into the public debate here, I think, is the fact that back when Maynard Keynes was writing about the need for deficit spending and stimulus, UK debt to GDP ratios were higher than they are now, right? If you imagine that this is a uniquely different situation, it is not. So the fact of the matter is that Britain has all along been a country with no immediate need to slash the deficit. It has a terrible long-run budget outlook. So does the United States. So for that matter, actually, that does Germany. We all have aging populations. We all have a lot of things to worry about. And we all need to find a way to balance our budgets, but not in the middle of a depression.
Okay, well, let's look at a country which is in deep trouble, Greece. How would your argument apply there? You can't seriously be suggesting that Greece borrows more.
Greece has the problem of not having its own currency. And so Greece has first of all, Greece was actually seriously irresponsible even during the good years, which is and you can say that there was some of that here, you can say there was some of that in the United States, but not to the same extent. But most important, Greece doesn't have its own currency. It cannot print euros, and that creates an enormous vulnerability. All of the severe crisis countries that we think of as being fiscal crisis countries are actually euro crisis countries. They're suffering from the fact of being stuck with what amount to overvalued exchange rates.
Okay, so what do they do?
Now, if you're the prime minister of a small European country, you have very few options, or rather you have only two options. One is to go along with whatever the Germans are demanding as the price of continued lending, or to leave the euro, which is a very nuclear option. But that's actually not very different from the governor of a U.S. state. The governor of Illinois doesn't have much freedom of action either. But Europe as a whole has the option of being more expansionary, of lending freely from the European Central Bank, of adopting a higher inflation target. But no, I mean, it's a terrible thing that has happened.
So if you were advising the Greek government now, what would you say to them?
Well, I've actually had conversations, not with them, but with, with European politicians.
With whom?
I can't tell you that. But
has there been a European government who's asked for your advice?
No. I just had conversations. But just have the. But here's the, if I were running the Greek government right now, I would actually be in a state of some despair, because I believe Greece must and will leave the euro. I think there is no alternative. But I also believe that whoever actually makes that decision, whoever actually says, okay, that's it, is going to have ended his political career. So there's a situation where this thing has to happen, but it has to happen with no one person's fingerprints on it.
When do you think it will happen?
Could happen in a couple of weeks if in this next election in Greece. If Syriza does come in first, although it looks like not. If not, it happens when, at a certain point, the European Central Bank says we cannot continue lending euros to allow the Greek banks to finance their ongoing bank run.
Do you think that would be the kindest thing for Europe to do, to actually find a way to eject Greece?
I think in the end it probably is going to be desirable for the Greeks as well as everyone else.
Well, let's just talk through what it would mean, because the first thing it would mean, assuming that you have this new drachma, is you have a new drachma that is devalued in relation to the euro, and yet you still have these massive debts which are now denominated in the new drachma and therefore even bigger than they were before.
No, well, the trouble is they're denominated in euros, and there's going to be some interesting negotiations.
But they'd be paid back in the new drachma.
Well, except they probably won't be. So our Argentina is our role model here after a fashion. And it's not an entirely positive role model. But Argentina had an allegedly irreversible commitment of 1 peso, $1, which then failed at the end of 2001. And they had a lot of debts that were in dollars, which they ended up paying about 30 cents on the dollar. So they ended up defaulting rather heavily on those debts. They had a huge devaluation of the peso. They had one terrible year because of the disruption caused by all of that, followed by a very strong economic recovery. Greece probably would be the same track, we hope. No one can be certain of that. But the point is their current path offers no prospect of recovery as far as the eye can see. We're looking at 50% youth unemployment and 150% debt to GDP ratios essentially forever.
And that's because you're saying that basically Germany should be doing more, that the rest of the Eurozone should be spending more and allowing for more inflation. And you're asking this of Germany.
I know, but it's a funny thing about the Germans. Why is it that the 1923 hyperinflation is seared into their memory, but the Chancellor Brüning deflation of 1930 to 32, which is the one that approximately led to you-know-what, somehow has vanished from their...
Yes. Okay, but when one looks at why it might be in economic terms, the hyperinflation, we should say what that meant. At one stage in 1923, prices were doubling every 2 days. They've got some figures for the loaf of bread. In 1922, it cost 163 marks. By September of the following year, it was 1.5 million marks. A couple of months later, it's 200 billion marks.
Yes, but this is... I have actually been proposing a rule that anyone who brings either Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe into the discussion should be ejected from the conversation, because we are talking about 3 or 4% inflation.